We had a great suggestion for a Tutorial Tuesday come in from Paul, who suggested we actually take a look at some of the different sliders in Lightroom and the differences between them, what they do, what you can achieve with each one, and ultimately how each one affects your photo and how they're different from each other. That's exactly what we're going to do. Today, we're going to look at clarity and texture. We're probably going to have a look at Dehaze as well. Let's dive into it. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring a brand new fresh photography tutorial. Now, before we go any further, if you have any of your own suggestions, any requests, anything at all that you want to say about Tutorial Tuesday, let me know down in the comments. I love hearing from you guys, so that is always much appreciated. Like I say, this is all based off a suggestion that we had in about Lightroom. I love doing Lightroom videos. I'm not going to lie to you, but what we're going to talk about actually will work with Capture One, it'll work with Photoshop. It's actually very much the same between Lightroom and Photoshop. So let's dive into it. We're going to take a look at the differences today between clarity and texture. We're going to look at what each one does, how they affect your photo, how they're a little bit different, and we're going to look at Dehaze as well. We're going to look at a bunch of different photos to actually get an idea properly of what they do. Now, all three of these can be found in the same place. So over on the right in the Develop tab, we've got them right here in the first panel. So in the basic editing, we've got down here under Presence, we've got Texture, Clarity, and Dehaze. Now, we're going to start by actually talking about clarity, even though it's the middle one there. The reason for that, it is actually one of the older sliders in Lightroom. Texture is reasonably new. It's not that new now, but it is reasonably new. So we're going to start with clarity and then move on to texture. And like I say, we'll talk about Dehaze as well. Now, the way that these different sliders work is they're affecting things like contrast within the image and the detail of the image as well. So clarity specifically affects the midtones, and it'll affect the contrast in the midtones. So that's the kind of 50% gray, roughly, area of the image. So for example, in this image here, it will affect these rocks, it'll affect the water, it won't affect the sky so much because that's more of a white, but it'll affect the rocks really nicely. It's not going to affect the kind of dark, the blacks, and then the whites, but those midtones, absolutely. And what it's going to do is boost the contrast in those midtones, which is going to give it the appearance of a little bit of sharpening. It's going to give a little bit of a grungy look. I quite like it. It helps to bring out a bit of detail in those midtones as well. Let's take a look at it here. So if I just bring the clarity up, I'll bring it all the way up to really exaggerate it. You can see how much it's affected these rocks. It's affected the water as well, but let's take a look at the rocks to begin with. So with it off, it almost now looks a little bit softer, a little bit less defined. But as we bring that up, it is affecting and boosting the contrast around the midtones, so specifically around these rocks. It works really nice. It does bring out some extra levels of detail. Like I say, it does give the appearance of sharpening. It actually does work quite similarly to Unsharp Mask in Photoshop, if you've ever used that. But generally speaking, I like to use this with a little bit of subtlety, so not going too far with it. Now, I think it looks really good for something like this, and actually I might use it for the rocks here, so I might boost it to something like that just to bring out a little bit more detail. I will also tend to lean into the look that it gives. So it tends to give a slightly more grungy look. Now, having brought the saturation back to 0, you can see if I bring that clarity back up, it does affect the color a little bit. And I tend to lean into that a little bit if I'm going to edit. So if I'm going to boost the clarity quite a bit, I will tend to bring that saturation down as well, just to really kind of balance that out and go for that slightly more grungy look, because clarity really leans into that. Now, clarity doesn't tend to work so well on skin tone. So I've got a portrait here. If I boost the clarity here, you can see it does give us that very grungy look, but it really does boost a lot of contrast in ways we probably don't want it to on skin tones. And this is pretty much across the board. So unless you're going for a very specific look, where it's very high contrast, you really want to accentuate the detail in the face, it tends not to be so good for skin tone. But we can use it the other way, where we can actually reduce it down a little bit, and it just can help to soften that skin a little bit. And certainly for portraits, and certainly for sort of more feminine portraits, this can work really well. So for example, I've done that there. I've just brought that down. If you bring it down too far, it's going to look ridiculous. and it's going to also make it very low contrast, but it can help to kind of soften the skin just a touch. Now, I will generally use clarity on something like this, a nice landscape photo. So if I boost that up, it's going to affect the rocks. It brings out a bit more detail, a bit of that kind of light, because they are definitely part of that kind of mid-tone section. I think that works really well to bring out a bit of detail. What we don't want to do is do it too much, because we almost get this kind of halo effect around some of the edges, because it is essentially boosting that contrast by lightening one edge and darkening the other edge. So we can end up with a bit of a halo. So we don't want to go too far with it, but it can just help to bring out a little bit of detail. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to clarity and also with texture and dehaze, I will almost always use a mask. So for example, on this photo, I would go into using a new mask. I would go create new mask, brush, and I would just brush onto these rocks like this. You could also use a different type of mask if you want to as well. And then I would just bring the clarity up so it's specific to the rocks. Maybe I'd do it on the beach as well, like that. And I'd do something like that, just because I don't want it necessarily affecting the rest of the image. If we come back to this portrait, the way that I would actually look to soften the skin tones using clarity is to come up here to a mask and actually select down here people. I'd select person 1, and Lightroom's going to do a really good job of allowing me to mask out different areas of her. So I could do facial skin, create mask, and then I can just come down and I can reduce that clarity. So now it is only doing so on her facial skin. So we're not losing contrast in the eyes or the hair or really anything else. We're just softening that skin just a touch. Texture is going to still affect the small details in a photo, but it does it in a much less harsh way than clarity does. And it still gives that nice impression of sharpness. I actually think it's better. It's a newer slider within Lightroom. I think it's better at bringing out that sharpness, bringing out some of those details. I still like clarity because I like the look that it gives. Let's take a look at texture now. So if I bring texture up, even if I bring it up to something like plus 50, right? That is immediately making quite a big difference to the photo. It's making it look much sharper. It's making it look much kind of punchier in that same way, but without some of the negatives of clarity, if you view them as negatives. I mean, they're not negatives if that's the look you want to go for, but texture is a much more subtle and less harsh way of adding this kind of look to your photo, right? So we've actually boosted it by quite a bit there, but it doesn't affect the color. It's not affecting the contrast nearly as much. Like I say, it's a much more subtle way of doing things, but we've got more detail now in the beach, more detail actually on Nala as well. Now, I probably, again, wouldn't boost it that much, but it's quite a nice way of doing things. If I was to boost the clarity as well, you can see it immediately starts to become more contrasty and the colors get affected. But with texture, if I just reset the texture for a second, it almost looks a bit softer now. And her fur in particular, you know, if I boost that texture, we are getting some nice detail there and in the beach as well. You can see the difference really well in a photo like this. So this is literally just the sea foam as it's coming in on the beach. Bring the clarity up and we're getting a punchier, more contrasty image. Let's bring that back down. Bring the texture up and we're just adding to that sharpness, right? We're just bringing out some of those details, but without the kind of different look that we get with clarity. So it's just a nicer way in a lot of ways to bring out that detail, add a bit of sharpness, add a bit of texture, right, to your image. So I tend to go for texture. It also works really well for portraits. So actually, as far as I know, it was designed specifically for portraits so that you could actually have a quick and easy way to soften that skin without using a blur, basically. And if we come back to our photo here of our model, we can actually go ahead, do that same mask. So this is on the facial skin, which is exactly how I would apply this. But instead of clarity, we can bring that texture down. And look at that, right? In fact, do you know what? Let's duplicate the mask. Let's do one with texture, one with clarity. So let's turn off the one with clarity. So this is just with texture down, right? I think that looks much more natural and we've softened that skin. It looks very beautiful. It's very flattering. Again, it can work really well, especially in a feminine portrait, just because you want to soften that skin, get a really nice sort of beautiful look to things. But if I turn that off and turn on the clarity, it does look good. And I think it works really well. I've certainly used it a lot in portraiture, but I now tend to use texture for this exact same thing. So negative texture to soften the face, because I think it gives a nicer final look. Now, if you go too far with it, of course, you get a very strange look where it's way too smooth. But, you know, a nice middle ground, as is the case with pretty much all editing, can really help when it comes to this. So essentially, clarity and texture are doing similar things, but a little bit different. Clarity is going to be affecting the contrast primarily in the midtones, which is going to affect the lights and the darks within those midtones. The color is going to make things very punchy, a bit grungy. It can look great, and especially on things like landscape photos, it can look fantastic. Whereas texture's a little bit more subtle, a little bit less harsh, a little bit less aggressive in the way it's actually changing your photo. And it can really help with bringing out some of the finer details. Some of those small details, either within a landscape or like in my dog's fur. And certainly negative texture, I think, is a slightly cleaner and more natural way to soften some skin when it comes to doing portraiture. Let's take a look at Dehaze as well, because it's in this same panel. So if we come back to this photo here of my dog Nala, we can go ahead and add some dehaze to the sky. Now, dehaze is going to massively affect the contrast and the saturation of lower detail areas of your image. Now, this works really well, like I say, on sky, on clouds, bringing out kind of the drama of those sort of situations. I would never apply it just globally to a photo. So for example, in this photo, if I bring the dehaze up, you can see it's really affecting everything, right? Nala, the beach, and the sky. Now the sky looks pretty interesting, but we're adding way too much contrast, way too much saturation to other parts of the image as well. And like I say, it does it on a sort of low detail, more sort of, I guess, a wider, a broader brush stroke, as opposed to the final detail of texture and of clarity as well. So let's bring that back down to 0. What I would do with this photo, for example, is create a new mask. I'd probably go select sky, and then I'd just come down to dehaze, where I would bring that up a little bit. So if we go, you know, again, we probably don't want to go too crazy with it, but even if we go all the way up to 50, which to be honest is much higher than I would normally go, we're just bringing out quite a lot of detail in the sky there. We're really bringing out the contrast in the clouds and making them pop and be a bit more dramatic within the image. It gives us a nicer backdrop, I suppose, to where Nala is sitting looking out to sea. And it's a little bit more of a visually interesting photo in the end of the day. Now, coming all the way back to this photo, of course, dehaze can also really affect things if you use it in a negative way. So if we go for a radial gradient here, kind of along like that, and we bring the dehaze down, we sort of add a little bit of haze, right? So it's in the name. The dehaze is going to be cutting through any low contrast, hazy, misty areas, right? But if we use it in a negative way, we are actually adding to that kind of haze, that mist. So we're kind of making things low contrast, but in a slightly more interesting way than just reducing the contrast. And it can really add to a photo in terms of atmosphere. We've done full tutorials just on that, just how you can use negative dehaze to enhance your photos. I think it's a great way of doing things. It's really interesting. Again, you probably want to use it sparingly. And for me, all three of these, I would always use with a mask on the photo rather than just globally applying it. But they're all really powerful and really useful. I would say that I use at least 2 of these in pretty much every photo that I edit, because there's always something that's going to do to the photo, whether it's going to make a subject pop, whether it's going to enhance a landscape, whether it's going to enhance a sky, whether I'm actually trying to add to an existing atmosphere in the photo, or simply bring out some of the detail that I know is there in the photo and just make it a bit more visible to the viewer when it's there. Now, we will be looking at the difference between things like saturation and vibrance. We'll be looking at things like tint and color temperature. We'll be looking at a bunch of stuff, the difference between highlights and whites, and then shadows and blacks, and all the different things, because I think it is actually really interesting, and it can be a bit confusing, to be honest, because some of them appear to pretty much do the same stuff. And then you kind of get into it and you realize, oh, it is kind of different, but I don't know if I fully get it. So we're going to go through all of them, and I'm excited about it. But if there's anything else you would like to see in a future Tutorial Tuesday, let me know down in the comments, because I am always up for doing the stuff you guys want to see. I want to make the tutorials that are the most helpful. I think we can all learn from each other. It's all very exciting. You guys have got some great insight, so I'd love to hear anything you like. Anything you like down in the comments, to be honest with you, even if it's just to say hi. I always appreciate it. I love to see it. There'll be links to all the different kit we use for these videos, these photos, all this stuff down in the description so you can go and check that out for yourself. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well because there's new content all the time. I will see you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching. When I'm not with you, I lose my mind. Give me a sign. Hit me, baby, one more time. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Imagine if that was the intro. Maybe it will be. Maybe it will be. No, it won't be.